So the next speaker is Shabna Begum, who is going to speak to us about the hidden histories of Sylheti lascars in Hackney. Thank you.
First and foremost, I want to say thank you to the Hackney History Festival organisers for inviting me, but for also being interested in showcasing some of these kind of very peripheral histories, things that are parked to the edges of our kind of understanding and imagination. I decided I would call this presentation Borders, Boats and Belonging. And I didn't actually know that Tommy Robinson was going to call his Unite the Kingdom rally today. Rally, racist demonstration, we can argue about that. But today's talk, therefore, feels all the more poignant for the fact that we are at a moment in our current history where we have to decide the kind of next chapter and how we want it written. I uncovered this through my parents' migration history. So that is a picture of my mum and dad taken in 1976. And that is my big sister standing just above my mum and dad. And then that's me on my mum's lap. I know, I was a cute baby, right? Really chunky, like chunky thighs. So this is 1976, and this is my parents trying to build a new life for themselves. And this photo, I showed this at an event at Hackney Museum last year, I think it was. And then someone contacted me to say, I think I know where your parents took that photo. And they actually think that it was taken at a studio not far from here in Clapton called Gibson Studios. And apparently that was a studio which had lots of Black and Asian families come to take these portraits to send back home as the image of the migrant success story of we've made it, we've come to London and we're building this magical, dreamy new life. So this was the picture that my parents took and sent back home. But actually the reality of where they were living and how they were living and how they were working was completely different to the image that was captured in this photograph and was sent back home to reassure, comfort, family back home. And so the story for me began with my parents. It began with going back to and listening to how my parents had migrated, the hardships they faced, and some of the struggles that they encountered. And one of the extraordinary things that I found when I spoke to my parents was that actually so much of what they told me sounded literally incredible, that there was no way that my parents were involved in what went on to become a squatters movement. My parents are like proper traditional, very, very conservative with a small c, not the other one. But like, you know, they don't make trouble, always like live by the rules, don't do anything to disrupt anything. That was certainly my experience of growing up with them as a teenager and then as a young adult. And so when they told me about this kind of squatter movement that they were part of, it genuinely sounded like there was no way that could be connected to my parents. But they were part of an incredible social movement, and that social movement was about this idea of belonging and a right to be here in this country and a right to the social resources of this country as well. And so this phrase, our struggle is also a struggle of memory against forgetting, sits with me. It's a Bell Hooks quote. It's Bell Hooks who talks about the fact that actually so much of the ways in which our kind of histories are erased is actually a form of violence against us as communities as well. So I wanted to talk about borders because borders are obviously so much part of the current discussion. But these borders, a lot of the work that I did was based in Tower Hamlets. And so borders between Tower Hamlets and Hackney have changed and shifted over time. Actually, the borders of the place from which my parents migrated and the journeys that they undertook have also been malleable and changed over time. And we have a discussion currently around borders and what they mean, about how fixed they should be, about the exclusionary nature of our borders, and how borders should keep people out as well as protect, supposedly, the people in. And these borders have been so much of our history, both in terms of migration and the communities that have arrived here. So when my dad was born, India was a full country and it was under the British Empire. By the time that my big sister was born, not only had India been partitioned, we now also had two separate countries created, from India to Bangladesh and Pakistan as well. Those borders were a consequence of the British Empire. They were based on conflicts and on power struggles that related to the ways in which that area had been ruled during the British Empire, the kind of power and the hierarchies and the privileges that were distributed during that time. And so borders, both over there and here, have always been negotiated, have always been challenged, and have always been the site of conflict. And right now we have people who claim those borders in ways that would see lots of the black and brown people in this audience here as excluded and outside of the community of belonging. And yet those borders have always been a feature of us and our identity and shaped that. Boats are also in the news, right? We keep hearing about these small boats and the numbers of people arriving on small boats. And yet our maritime history, the way in which boats and ships have shaped this island, have also been neglected. This is some of the work that I did to try and connect how it was that my parents ended up in East London in the first place. So I will come back to the squatters story because that's the place where I did most of my research, and I'll come on to how I did that. But one of the things that I wanted to find out was what was the connection between Bengalis and the Bangladeshi community that are so prominent in Tower Hamlets and in Hackney. How is it that they arrived in East London, and what was that relationship? And it goes back hundreds of years. And one of the people that I always think about, and I'm thinking about the stand over there about women in history and being written out, this incredible woman, Rosina Visram, has spent her whole life looking through the archives and meticulously documenting how the Indian and wider community have been part of the British fabric, its economic infrastructure, its financial infrastructure for hundreds of years. And part of that history is found, and you can see it in the archives. So the reason why you had in fact, I'll fast go over to here. You had the East India Company. The East India Company, I think most people are familiar with it. Big corporation, merchant shipping enterprise, went across, not originally aiming for India, but aiming for kind of Indonesia and the spice market there, but came across India, decided that there was a textile industry and a textile market there, which they could exploit to their advantage, which they did. And so the East India Company went to India, to what was then India, and began what was an extraction of resources and an extraction of labour. And that labour ended up with ships travelling across. You had sailors who would have travelled across on sometimes these really long journeys, 6-month journeys from the ports in East London all the way across to India at the time. And by the time they got there, often many of these sailors might have died, but also many deserted when they got there. They didn't want to do the journey back. It was more profitable for them to stay and be in the kind of employed by the Indian princes in the armies there. So many of the English sailors deserted and decided they didn't want to come back. And so therefore these English shipping merchants needed to have an additional form of labour. And they employed what were Indian seamen. They were called lascars at the time. And the term lascar was actually a formal title. They were recognised in employment law. And what it meant was essentially that these Indian sailors, some of them from Sylhet, So that you can't see it there. That's a shipping register from 1882. And that lists all of the names of people, which areas of India they're from, including from Sylhet, which is where my parents are from, a small region in the northeast of now what is Bangladesh. And these sailors were traveling across on these ships. They were usually working in the furnaces, in the kind of the right at the bottom of the ships, doing the hardest work. They actually had it written into their employment contracts that they would have fewer rations in terms of the amount of food they were given for the duration of the journey. Their berths were considerably smaller than the berths that were given to the white sailors. And that was written contractually into their employment. The other thing that was written in was that they couldn't stay when they came to the UK, to England. They had to have a return voyage. So I'll come back to that. But what you can see there is that Indian sailors were traversing the seas on these English ships carrying goods like cotton, jute, muslin, spices, tea from India, which became a global export for the East India Company, and brought a huge amount of wealth into Britain at the time. And that wealth was stored in warehouses just opposite Liverpool Street, and just near Liverpool Street was their main office as well. So the proximity of the East India Company, it was literally around the corner from us in Hackney, the offices, the warehouses. And what you had there, over there, is a picture that's often used. You will, if you've ever looked up lascars, then that's the kind of image you do see. You see that image on the left-hand side. It's an image that was kind of shared as part of the way that the East India Company and Britain wanted to project itself and its role in the world. So that was certainly not the kind of uniforms that people were wearing when they were actually doing the work. So this was sailors on a P&O cruise liner. I think it was called the Viceroy of India. And that was taken by kind of a studio photographer that was based on the ship, and you could have your picture taken with these sailors at different points. So they were literally props that were brought out to kind of be photographed with, so you could document your kind of journey and your kind of your cruise. So really, again, thinking about how we project images. Even my parents, right? My parents took that photo in a studio, dressed in their best clothes, but that wasn't the clothes they were wearing. And here again, you see a state and a company doing exactly the same. We project images, we project an idea of ourselves and who we aspire to be, when the reality was very, very different. And actually, for lots of these lascars who were sailing into the East End of London, many of them did mutiny. Many of them were involved in kind of challenges to their employers on the basis of those rations. So this wasn't a passive kind of group of sailors who were traversing the seas and being treated badly without any challenge. There was significant challenge to them. But many of those lascars ended up right here in Hackney. So I walked past it. So I took this photo the other day. So I kind of live in Walthamstow now. I train it into Liverpool Street and then walk to Hoxton. That's my journey to work mostly. And so I walk past this junction almost kind of, at least 3 days of the week. And this junction is Kingsland's High Street. It's the bridge, if you're familiar with it. And then there's Cotton's Gardens just there if you're walking from Liverpool Street. Is on your right towards Hackney. And that is where one of the boarding houses where these lascars ended up staying. So some of these lascars who were, remember, legally compelled to return, they were not allowed to settle here. That was part of the Asiatic Articles that they had. And they were allowed to work for the English merchants, but they were not allowed the right to settle. So what if you didn't have a voyage back immediately, what you had to do was find somewhere to live. Now, there was a point at which lots of these Indian lascars were kind of impoverished, they were living homeless, they were kind of out and about on the streets, and it became an embarrassment. It was an embarrassment because some of these lascars were begging. There was one point where 40 Indian sailors were found dead, frozen to death overnight in a winter in Hackney in East London. And it was these kinds of events which made headlines, which prompted parliamentary inquiries. There were committees that reported around the scandal of these Indian sailors who were being left in these impoverished conditions, didn't have the appropriate clothing to survive the weather, and who were a nuisance as well. So the East India Company was forced to create some boarding houses. And so one of the boarding houses was just here on Cotton's Gardens, and another one a bit further away. So two of them at least were in Hackney. There were others in Shadwell and Limehouse as well. So these boarding houses were where the proprietors, the owners, were paid to provide clothing, food and board for these sailors until they would catch the next voyage, where they could kind of work their way back to India. And actually on that shipping register, the shipping register would say how many times this sailor might have sailed backwards and forwards between India. And there were several of them that had done it many, many times. So some of these sailors were repeatedly doing this journey backwards and forwards, staying for short periods in between. And so this boarding house, it appears in both court documents. It appears in court documents because actually it was eventually closed because of neighbours saying that it was a nuisance, that the sailors were rowdy. And I think that there are some reports around the kind of drinking culture. Again, imagine if you are a sailor, you are someone who's usually kind of very much kind of doing lots of activity and work, and then you are confined to a boarding house, and I imagine there was not a lot to do. So the boarding house in this one in Cotton's Gardens was closed down in kind of the late 1800s, I think. But I think that the boarding houses, whilst they were often a space of camaraderie, were also a site of control and containment as well. And it reminds me very much of some of the ways in which we can see how the government treats people seeking asylum in this country now, where we have this idea of kind of both benevolence, but actually underneath it there is this quite a kind of sinister line of control and containment. And certainly the boarding houses, whilst they were, so people were free to come and go, those boarding houses were also part of a containment and control architecture at the time as well. So the lascars who arrived into the East End of London would have come for over hundreds of years. They would have had experience of settling in and around the East End. The lascars were mainly men, and I don't go into this at all, but I just did want to kind of highlight that Hackney also has a long history of having seen Indian women be part of the kind of historical presence of Indian communities. So we know ayahs were the kind of nannies, the equivalent of nannies, who would have travelled, like I said, these really long journeys, 6-month journeys. If you had children going backwards and forwards between India and England, then you had those women, the children, who would have needed looking after. And obviously you needed some form of help. And so again, very similar to the lascars, often these ayahs would have just done the travelling, and they wouldn't have been invited to stay with the family once they had arrived. So there was a need for a boarding house, a place for these women to stay. And this is King Edward's Road, where there is now a blue plaque to kind of commemorate the fact that this house existed and that Indian women were part of this community back at this time. So there is a long history of Indian sailors, India being partitioned, divided, and then the Bangladeshi community that emerged from that, and its connection to East London and to Hackney. And this is where my work comes in. So like I said, my parents, they are the bane of my life, but God loved them. They are also obviously my parents, and I love them, and they have given me so much of what I have been kind of lucky enough to have in my life in terms of access to education and everything else. But they had told me about this Bengali squatters movement and the fact that in the 1970s, when I was born into a squatted house just off Brick Lane called at number 12 Deal Street. And they told me about the fact that they had, along with lots of other Bengali families, squatted not because they wanted to, not because they were making an intentional political decision, but because they needed to survive and they needed a place to call home for both myself and my big sister. And they were one of hundreds of Bengali families who had come up. My dad arrived here in 1963. So my dad came in 1963, my mum came in 1975. So in 1963, my dad had been around. He worked in some of the garments factories. He then worked in kind of restaurants as the kind of sous chef and so on. So he was working multiple jobs. And he had been here since 1963. He'd put himself on the council housing list, particularly in Tower Hamlets. And like many other Bengali families, the way in which the housing system operated meant that actually you had to have stayed in the location in London for at least 5 years. In Tower Hamlets, you had to have non-stop residency for 52 weeks. And if you moved or kind of went out of the area for any period of time, then you were disqualified and went right the way back to the bottom of the line. Now, that is a classic example of institutional discrimination, where actually the rules don't say that they're intending to cause harm to a particular community, but for a migrant community whose kind of residential status was always precarious and meant movement, it meant that you always ended up at the bottom of the pile. So my dad, who did go back home to go and get my mum, was disqualified and went right the way back to the bottom of the list. That, as well as the fact that you had lots of the housing officers had a significant amount of power in deciding who did and didn't get flats at the time. And so there was a lot of discretionary power that these kind of individuals had. And it just meant that actually you'd go and the housing officer would decide they didn't like the look of you. And again, they wouldn't offer you a property. So, you know, lots of different reasons, but it just meant that Bengali families were finding it incredibly difficult to get housing. So my dad had stayed in Brick Lane before my mum came along in kind of what were multiple occupancy houses, very similar to lots of the kind of black communities who were living in and around the area in London at the time too. And you had, my dad called them triple shift beds. They were literally triple shift beds because people paid not for a room, you paid for amount of time in a bed. And that worked because people were working all sorts of hours, night shifts, day shifts, you name it, people were working them. And so you paid for a particular time. So that bed was literally always being slept in because you were getting out and someone else was getting in. He described to me actually, and he described to me one time where this was a time for paraffin heaters as well. So this was, he described to me the time where there was a fire in one of these homes and how two young men who had just arrived to the country did not escape that fire, who died in that fire because of the nature of the fire had started in the stairwell, and everyone who had was beneath that particular level of the house managed to escape. And these two young men who had just arrived, who had arrived not less than 2 weeks ago, didn't manage to escape. And in fact, they jumped from the windows and died having tried to escape the fire. Those were the kind of conditions that these men had been living in as young single migrant men. But then the women began to join them. And again, this is kind of related to the legislative and the political conversation. By the early 1970s, you had the kind of beginning of you definitely had Enoch Powell and the Rivers of Blood speech. You had this idea that there were too many migrants. There were too many migrants coming into the country. We needed to close the borders. And so that created the 1971 Immigration Act. What that meant was that people like my dad, who had no intention of staying here, he always saw himself as a transnational commuter. He was always intending to go back home. He was intending to make his money and then go back home and live a good life with his family. But it meant that he got worried, and many other men got worried, that they were not going to be able to bring their families over and that they were going to be separated. And so instead of realising that dream, he brought my mum and my big sister over, which is what happened in the early 1970s. And this is what caused the major problem, because these men had put up with these awful living conditions, but couldn't do that now when you had a wife and children. You couldn't live in those same conditions. And so when the housing system would not give these men the flats and houses they needed, they decided to take it for themselves. This is also the post-war period. So lots of these, so the GLC, Tower Hamlets, and some of Hackney had decanted lots of their properties, and they were going to either knock them down and redevelop them or refurbish them. But money had run out, and so often what you had was quite a lot of these properties were empty. They were sitting empty, and you had a Bengali community that was struggling with their housing needs. And so they saw other squatters, lots of squatters in and around East London at the time. There was a vibrant squatting community of people who were trying and experimenting with different ways of living, and who had knocked kind of houses together, gardens together, were experimenting with communal living. This was not of the same variety. These were people trying to survive. But they took the inspiration from those squatter communities, and they decided that they would do something similar for themselves. So they began to take those houses. This is the front cover of Race Today, which was a collective, a Black Power collective that gathered to give intellectual and legal support to the Bengali families. This was the likes of I think I'll say it in the next one. This was the likes of Darcus Howe. So this is what prompted me, because my dad never he's not political, but he's like, yeah. And then Darcus Howe came along, and I thought, how do you know Darcus Howe? Darcus Howe, who was, for me, when I was growing up, this incredible intellectual figure, fiery character. His politics were incredible. He was he just wouldn't, he wasn't going to be told by anyone about what he should and shouldn't think about his rights as a black man in this country. And that people like Darcus Howe, Mala Sen, Farooq Dondi, they gathered. They were inspired by the Bengali families that were squatting. They saw it as direct action against a racist state, and so they decided that they wanted to lend their support. And so this magazine, from 1974 onwards, began to document every single thing that happened between the council, the GLC, and the Bengali squatter community. And the Bengali Housing Action Group was born in 1976, and that Housing Action Group supported families who were squatting not only in Tower Hamlets and Spitalfields, but extending right into Bethnal Green and into Hackney as well. And the phrase there in Bengali under the title Amra ei desh sarbona means we won't leave this country. That's what the Bengali community were saying back in 1976. I think that's a cover from. So this was a community who were drawing on the fact that they had an entitlement. And this is, again, why I come back to that phrase of the struggle of memory. Because the struggle of memory isn't just a struggle of memory of communities who've had their histories erased and ignored. It's a struggle of memory because we have this British idea, an idea of Britishness, which seeks to exclude these histories and which does not acknowledge the fact that empire, colonialism, the extraction of that wealth has always framed and been part of the kind of infrastructure of who we are, whether it's the economic, financial infrastructures of this country, but also through these kind of movements, whether it was actually the Indian Sailors Unions. So the Indian Sailors Unions who rejected the fact that they had these specific articles which gave them inferior terms to their white British seamen. Or whether it is these groups that were round the corner from here in the 1970s who were fighting for social housing and saying that people were entitled to social housing. These parts of history, these historical contributions aren't just the histories of these communities. They're also our wider history of how we see and should see ourselves. And so I come back to, this is 1976. That's Mala Sen, who was an activist who supported this movement. And in the middle there, the person in the suit is Khosrow Mia. He's someone I interviewed who was one of the activists during this period. He'd never seen this picture of himself. I'd found this in one of the Race Today magazines. And someone else had spotted it and said, oh, we know him. And he was next on my list to interview. So I was so excited. And so the work that I did that eventually went into the PhD that I did, I only did the PhD because that was the only way that I could find to do this research. Not an academic, never wanted to be an academic, but I wanted to kind of record and get this history. And so it was interviewing people like Khosrow Mia and so many other squatters who were there at the time, including women. And this is the really important thing, that actually Khosrow Mia, he was part of the kind of squatter movement in terms of that activity, that both the kind of breaking into the houses and securing them for families. He was also part of the vigilante patrols because, of course, you had the National Front who were rioting across East London, who were threatening the Bengali community, both with violence and with the kind of newspaper corner that they had on Brick Lane and Bethnal Green. And so often the men are the most prominent and visible of this movement. But it was always the women who were the guardians of the squats. The women who were there day to day, who would have dealt with the council officers who would have come along to knock on the door, as my mum did, or the police, where the police had no business to be involved. It was not a criminal offence, and yet the police were part of that. This demonstration in 1976 was both led by the squatter activists, but it was also a movement that was organised against the police racism that the community faced. So the fact that actually when people were defending themselves against racist violence, they were often the ones that were then picked up, arrested and taken into the police station. And so the 1976 demonstration was a demonstration in the wider sense of thinking about the anti-racist movement and building an anti-racist movement. And people the Asian community called itself Black at the time. So this was a Black Power movement. And you would see the signs that were on these demonstrations about housing for the Black community, because the understanding of race and identity at the time was very much that you had different experiences across these different communities, but you had a shared struggle against a racist state. And then you have there the picture of 1978, the Rock Against Racism, and the wider cultural movement, that there was a beginning, an understanding that actually the rise of the National Front was a threat, and that certain artists who had come out and said racist things, that actually it was a responsibility of the wider musical cultural community to also respond, that it wasn't just that you left these things to community activists on the ground or legal kind of conflicts to be resolved in courtrooms. But actually there was a wider and shared responsibility for people to speak from whatever position they were on the racism that communities were facing. And so I will bring it back to today, because if I was not here today, then I would have been on the demonstration in central London against the Robinson rally. We have an idea of ourselves that has come back, which is this idea that borders are fixed, that the borders are there to exclude certain groups of people. And we have this idea that people like my mum and dad, I'm just going to go back to that picture, who have been here for all their lives now, who kind of, my dad has been here from being a young man who has worked his way through his whole life, and who now lives in Hackney. So we ended up living in Hackney. So my mum and dad live in Hackney, around the corner from here. I grew up in Hackney and worked for most of my life in a Hackney school. And the idea that yet again we are at a place where we have our streets and the streets of London taken over by people who would look at people like me, look at people like my mum and dad, and say that we don't belong and that this isn't our home, and that we somehow need to get back to this idea of a Britain that doesn't have people like my parents and our contributions, or indeed the involuntary contributions of empire, of colonialism, of slavery that have been absolutely at the heart of building this country and the wealth and the kind of social rights that this country now has. The idea that we are not part of that is, to me, extraordinary. And yet today we will have thousands of people who will join a demonstration. And I would ask all of us to think about, how do we respond? Each of us have a responsibility. There are people feeling unsafe in this country currently, even in Hackney. And I will just say this, actually, that my son, who is 15, he was called the P word in Hackney last year. And this is something that I never thought would happen to my children not now. And we might think we're safe, and we are safer in Hackney than we are in so many other parts of the country where people don't have the visibility and the communities and the solidarity that I get from being part of this community. But I think, I just wanted to kind of end on that: borders, boats, belonging. I think there is a responsibility on all of us to share these histories, not just for nostalgic and intellectual curiosity, but because they then give us a responsibility to think about how we show up in the here and now. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
I was going to say, I think the problem is that, as I grew up, always lived in Hackney, and my education was here. The people here, the white people here, they don't understand that our role in India, really, we went out there, we took all the riches, imposed our culture upon the population. It started an awful lot of war, killing with the partitions and everything. And as I understand it, the English told the Indian peoples that, Queen Victoria was their mother. They could come home. They had a passport, in other words, a passport, not literally, but they were able to come to this country. And I think a lot of people educated in this country don't know that, because we weren't taught that, because they didn't want us to know it. And that, when I hear my contemporaries talk about, too many immigrants, etc., I say, but they paid for that. They paid for it with what we did. And that's not understood by the Tommy Robinsons of the day.
I think you're absolutely right. What I didn't say is that I work for the Runnymede Trust, which is a racial justice charity and think tank now. And one of our key priorities is education, because actually, if your curriculum and if what you learn at school does not invite you to see this world that you shaped and were part and shaped us, then you are never going to have that understanding, right? You always I feel like I'm forever saying, we haven't just arrived. We've always been here in some shape or other. We've always been here. You might have kind of erased us and put us to the periphery, but we have been here all along. And it's the education system currently that is so politicised and which refuses to acknowledge that. So there's no individual blame for this. It is about kind of making sure that our education system. So right now the curriculum is being drafted, and we have been trying really hard to say, hang on a minute, if you don't like these racist riots, and if you don't like the Tommy Robinsons of the world, and you want to correct this this distorted idea of who we are, then you need to make sure that every child is entitled to a history education that shows all of this, right? So 100% agree.
Hi. Very interesting. I just looked Sylhet up on my Google map, and it's a tiny little bit way up northeast of Bangladesh. And I've not really understood why the community in Tower Hamlets is so focused on that area. So are you telling us that that's because that's where they got all the lascars from?
So a lot of...
Can I just finish? But then go one step back. Why did all the lascars come from that particular area of Bangladesh?
Yeah, okay. That's a really good question. So Sylhet is exactly the part of Bangladesh which isn't kind of port, not coastal, it's northeast, but it is a riverine kind of landscape. So there was always a big boating and fishing industry. And the East India Company had a lot of contact with Bengal in particular. It was where you had a lot of the textile trade, muslin, being traded. And in fact, one of the East India revenue collectors, Robert Lindsay, he mined limestone in my dad's village. So Satok is my dad's little village. So if you want to go even tinier, my dad's village is where this guy, Robert Lindsay in the 1780s went across, East India revenue collector, was there, kind of extracted huge amounts of limestone, sold, caught and sold lots of elephants, made a fortune, came back here, and then bought his castle estate in Fifeshire in Scotland. So there was a direct kind of, Sylhet had this intimate connection between the East India companies. There was that. There was a boating tradition there as well. And those sailors that were on those boats got recruited into Calcutta. So that comes back to the port city. And that connection became a really strong connection. So the recruitment pipeline was very strong between Calcutta and Sylhet. And that brought the Sylheti sailors, including, like I said, all the way, if you look at this, you can't see it there. That's a Duke of Devonshire, 1882 shipping register. You can see there the number of sailors who are sailing from Sylhet, not spelt in the way that, and this is one of the difficulties of finding archival information. So Sylhet is not spelt as we spell it now. It's spelt differently here. But Sylhet, as this kind of curious place in the northeast of Bangladesh, kind of landlocked but riverine, became the centre of recruitment for Calcutta sailors.
I was struck by the migration story you told us, and I was just reflecting on your parents and people like them, and what they brought with them, the few good clothes they had and the objects, and very little. I don't know if you know anything about that. I'm just reflecting on my background where I wonder these things too, which and this is an Italian American background coming from Italy to the States, and very uncertain what could be brought with you. So I don't know if you know anything about these things.
Yeah, I think my parents moved around so much so that some of the things that they did bring with them. So there were certain things that I do remember. So there was a very small red leather suitcase that was my mum's. And God, do I wish we'd kept that now. Now I recognise that was such an important part of their story. I remember the lining of it, and it all got frayed and tattered. But I think that for communities like my parents, who were very transient, moved around a lot, they didn't keep a lot of things. And in fact, when I did my oral histories, I always started with, well, tell me about the objects that you carried, and tell me about the carpets and the wallpaper and stuff. And they're like, why are you interested in any of that? That wasn't important to us, because I think that those kinds of things become important to us in later life as you settle, but they weren't settlers. They saw themselves as commuters, even back then. So unfortunately my parents don't have kind of artifacts that I would love to have been able to kind of treasure now and keep. I remember some of them from my childhood, even older things, like my mum used to sew on a sewing machine at home, and even that now I thought, why did we not keep that sewing machine? We didn't, but I went and found one on eBay, and I kind of got one in my house now, because I feel like I want that, even if it's not my mum's one. But yeah, I think that's the thing about a kind of histories of migrant communities, is that often they are transient, they don't hold on to objects. But there's another thing, and this is what I found was really kind of both sad as well as enlightening, is that when the world has told you in so many different ways that your history isn't important, you don't hold on to stuff. My parents and so many of the people that I spoke to were like, why are you interested? This isn't important. I was like, what do you mean? This is so important. This is really, really significant stuff. But you absorb when the world has told you it's irrelevant and so on. So there's something about kind of us, which was what I did, was to document even the oral histories that I collected. That's a record that we have. But yeah.
I came to this event because of the word lascar, or lascars as you pronounced it, because I knew about them from my father, and he lived in the East End of London. My father, and he knew some people who he described as lascars, as well as Somalis, who were the sailors in the East End of London, who worked in the Merchant Navy. Also at school, we were taught about the Second World War and Britain being close to running out of food, and the British Merchant Navy saved us and how brave they were. And we just assumed they were Brits because that's what we were told. And it was only later when I worked with the Sylheti community in the beginning of the 2000s on health projects, both in North Paddington and in Tower Hamlets, that I discovered that the lascars were from Sylhet, or a lot of them, and I met some, and I interviewed them and spoke to them. We spoke about history and stuff like that. And I suddenly thought, I was so proud of the Merchant Navy, the British Merchant Navy being so brave, even though they probably didn't know what they were getting themselves into. But they died and sunk to the bottom of the sea. That a lot of these British Merchant Navy were lascars from Sylhet who had travelled down to Chittagong and then sailed on those things to save Britain at its moment of need. And yet no one knows about that. And there's no memorial to those people. And I wonder whether you know of any memorial to those people.
I
Should there be?
Yeah.
And where does the word lascar come from?
There is no kind of there's no a consensus about where it comes from. It's not a Bengali word. It's not but there's an idea that it kind of is a combination of a Portuguese, Dutch kind of reference to sailors, Indian sailors at the time. So it's not an Indian word or a Bengali word that I recognise. But coming back to, I mean, you're speaking to the wider point that we've just made, that so many of the things that we assume and talk about as though they are a white British history are actually a very colourful history instead. And whilst there are no memorials, I know that there are 18 lascar sailors buried in Gibraltar Road, or were buried in Gibraltar Road in Hackney, because, like I said, so many of these sailors would have died here in that kind of transitional period whilst they kind of were waiting for the voyage back. So the Ayers home has a blue plaque, but I don't think we'd have a memorial in Hackney, certainly. I think Ayub Ali's house, he was one of the sailors who supported lots of the Indian lascars in the early 1920s. That has a blue plaque, and that's in in Liverpool Street as well. So, yeah, long way to go there.
Okay, big round of applause for Shabna. Very, very interesting talk.
So this